Hello, this is Billie Tarascio with the Modern Arizona podcast, joined today by Ryan McPhie, criminal defense attorney here in the Valley. And we're going to be talking about two ballot measures that passed here in Arizona that make some pretty significant changes to Arizona criminal law. Ryan, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Absolutely. This is not your first time. You have been an incredibly valuable guest to people explaining about Arizona criminal law. So I appreciate you coming back. We've got two to talk about, 313 and 314. 313 both passed overwhelmingly, and they create new penalties, and 314 creates new crimes. So let's start with 313. This is the ballot measure that puts anyone convicted of child sex trafficking in prison for life. It passed overwhelmingly, but many of the professionals, I would say, in the criminal courts and in the criminal bar, which is the legal community, don't support it. Let's talk about that.
Sure. Yeah, it's an interesting one because 313, as you say, develops a whole new sentencing scheme for a crime that's already existing. And I think a couple of the issues were that, for child sex trafficking, there were already really harsh sentencing guidelines in place that were specific to those types of crimes. And I think a couple of things that people don't realize, and we talked about, this, sometimes we have a hard time with a statute that is creating such a harsh penalty for something that is a terrible crime. And people have a hard time getting on board with us to say, yeah, that's too harsh, because child sex trafficking is something that is bad. It's something that nobody wants to support and say is a good thing. The question in this one, as far as criminal defense attorneys, is it appropriate? Is it the type of case? Because what has happened is, it's not just if you're convicted of child sex trafficking. It's if you are convicted of any crime or any level of child sex trafficking within that chapter of statutes and laws. And so what happens is, if somebody is convicted of any crime within that chapter, it is a mandatory natural life sentence in prison, which is exceptionally harsh. Now, again, many people will hear that and say, so what? It's child sex trafficking. we don't really care. And so I give one example that we see a lot. Probably the most common child sex trafficking statute charges that we see is a situation where a police force has put up a sting. And there's a police officer who knows, he's a 50-year-old man who's communicating with this person online and creating a conversation, at some point says that they are under the age of 18, and they lure them to meet up, and then they convict them. So, or they arrest them. So that would be a mandatory life sentence.
Okay. So
murder is not a mandatory life sentence.
So solicitation, attempted solicitation, because that's what we're talking about. Attempted solicitation of a minor would qualify for life in prison. People need to know that.
Under those circumstances, yes.
People need to know that. I would hope that it's a deterrent, because what you just described is incredibly common, disgustingly common. And is the sentence fair under those circumstances? I mean, I can certainly understand how it's debatable, but we have this massive issue, and the people are just, they're looking for ways to combat that massive issue. One question
is something that...
Go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, I think we have a delay. So I think that there are some real problems with that. Again, a situation that I like to tell people about is, everybody wants to be really tough on crime until, you realize that a lot of these people who get caught up in these stings are people who are socially very awkward, have real issues, and they fall for these kind of traps that the police set. Multiple of our clients have been autistic, who have been, they don't have a girlfriend, they don't have prospects, and somebody is talking to them online. This is incredibly sad that this person is now subject to a natural life sentence.
So Ryan, which crimes qualify for life imprisonment under this new ballot measure?
So really, it's all going to be charged as a particular crime, which is, as we said, child sex trafficking. But there's just multiple ways that can happen. Like we said, we have that, that example, but the way that they list it out in the statute, it's ARS 133212. And there's a lot of broad things, basically causing any minor to engage in prostitution, using any minor for the purposes of prostitution, permitting a minor who is under the person's custody or control to engage in prostitution. Again, I could see that getting very broad if they wanted to, and saying, hey, this is your kid. You might not have known they were doing this specific thing, but you gave
Permitted
them
it.
freedom to do that. Receiving any benefit for an account of procuring or placing a minor in any place of prostitution, receiving any benefit pursuant to an agreement to participate in prostitution, financing, managing, supervising, controlling, transporting, or financing the transportation of a minor with the intent of that minor to engage in prostitution. So if you drove somebody, they asked you to give them a ride and you knew what it was for, you would be subject to life in prison for that. Providing means by which a minor engages in prostitution. Again, that's providing means. That's a very broad statute.
Driving somebody somewhere. So
yeah.
your friend asks you to go drive them. You know what they're doing. You drive them there. That could qualify.
Yes, that is absolutely qualifying for a natural life sentence. And the difference between a life sentence is one where you could be eligible for parole at some point in the future. Right. This is a natural life sentence. And so it would not be subject to that. So basically, I think that's the point, right? Is that anything that falls within any part of that act or situation could qualify.
One of the questions that I got when talking about this is, I've heard that could be used against victims. Can you talk about that for a minute?
I don't see that. Again, I could talk to Dave here in my office and see if he could see a type of a situation where it could be. But I guess probably where they're coming from on that is a lot of times the victims in these cases, they are making choices. Mm-hmm. Certainly they are induced and they are coerced, and it is horrible. And they should not be charged with the crime on that. But certainly, just as if you look at like an adult prostitution situation, it's not just the person, who's engaged the services of a prostitute, but it's the prostitute themselves that could face those charges, and often do. In child sex trafficking, that is not generally the case. And so I suppose I could see that they could charge it that way. And if they did, she or he would be subject to a natural life sentence. And not just subject to it, it's mandatory. The judge doesn't even have a choice.
I think the concern is that many people who are being trafficked are also made to recruit. And so now someone who is under the control of a trafficker who's recruiting other people, do they have a defense? Is the defense duress or something?
Yes, the defense would be duress. I think it's also, it's one of those where a prosecutor in these situations is making a judgment call where, sure, under the elements, I might be able to prove that this is happening, but as a matter of policy, we're not going to be charging that, which is always great until you get a bad prosecutor or until you get a crazy prosecutor's office who decides, yeah, I'm going to use that discretion to charge them. We generally don't see it, but it certainly is within their power and within the statute to do that.
And there's got to be a lot of gray area between those people who are trafficked as minors, right? Trafficked as minors, and then, maybe move up in the organization. And now the question is, are they still under control? I mean, probably, but where's the line?
No, I think they would be at that point. If somebody, kind of ages out of being into that minor statute, and then is still participating in the trafficking or the business of it, absolutely they would be. So even though at one point they were a victim, and they could still certainly be viewed, and I still would view them as a victim of this trafficking situation, once they become someone, who is victimizing others, that's how they're going to get viewed.
In watching the criminal system over the last year or so, it seems like it's a situation where you just would have prosecutors not charge the crime. That's what I thought when I read it. Okay, well, prosecutors, because I'm watching what sentences are, and they're not even close to life. And Kaylee Cusick was on the show, and she was molested for a period of 6 years, and her abuser, was convicted, but then got 6 months. So it seems like prosecutors are going to be very adverse to charging these crimes. Do you think that's what's going to happen?
I don't know, because they charge these a lot. And they really seem to like to charge these cases. And it's not just the prosecutor's office, it's the police agencies. We see certain police agencies that really push these sting operations. Is, like I said, that's normally where we see them. And it's, there's going to be some kind of friction between the agencies and the prosecuting offices if every time they're turning over, an ironclad case, they're saying, well, we don't like the sentencing structure to this type of case, and so we're not going to charge it. What generally happens in a lot of these cases where there's mandatory type of, sentencing structure. So a couple of examples. Drug sales is one thing, but if you're selling meth, there's a whole separate sentencing structure that's incredibly harsh.
Okay.
Or aggravated DUI is another one where there's some harsh parts of it, where what we're able to do sometimes is plead it to another crime. And we avoid that. So that potentially I could see that happening. So instead of a prosecutor, convicting or doing a plea offer to something that falls under that statute, maybe a different one. The problem is with this type of crime, they want it on the record to show that this person has committed this type of crime. And so that can be challenging to find an alternative statute that makes the prosecutor happy as far as what they're trying to show is on this person's record and doesn't put somebody in prison for life. And I think the other piece of this is that you have a lot of the same people who are saying, good, I want these people to go to prison for life, are also the same, and this is, sweeping generalization, but many times are the same type of people who are saying, I want to cut out government waste and government spending. And you're now, the expense of putting somebody in prison for the rest of their life is astronomical. And so sometimes that's helpful to kind of at least get to the economics of it and say that you might not like this person. I might not like this person. It's not a likable person as far as what they did. But is putting them in prison the best thing is it fair compared to other crimes? And does it make sense as far as our society goes?
Would child sex abuse or attempted sex abuse, does that qualify?
Kind of outside. Again, I'm a little bit rusty on these ones, but my inclination would be no. That would be separate.
Okay.
And that this is specific to the trafficking of minors, not to abuse. So there could be child abuse, there could be sex conduct with a minor, things like that, and those do not fall under this sentencing structure.
The last question on this ballot measure: have you ever seen these types of sentences, these types of crackdowns deter crime? Will it make a difference?
That's a tough one. I mean, I think if the education is out there, you and I could look at it and say, well, yeah, of course, who would ever do this if that was the situation? Obviously, that's not how people think most of the time when they're in the midst of this. Like I said, many of these people are either not aware of the law, first of all, but if they are aware of the law, they're not saying, looking at it and saying this act is qualifying and maybe I'm an exception for one reason or another. But also, many of the people who are committing these crimes, it's a compulsive disorder. It's an issue, or it's a complete, like I said, a lot of our clients that do this have some form of autism or some type of, issue with their cognitive thought process. And in those cases, I don't see how, deterrent really works very well.
Right. Okay. I know recently there was an article that many college students, like an abnormally large number of college students, are being recruited to traffic in illegal immigrants. And they are basically thought of it like Uber, like, I'm going to make some money to drive some people. And they just didn't either take the time to fully think through, like, you are participating in human trafficking. They just felt like so apart from the crime. And I could see like that type of behavior is definitely going to fall under this statute.
Yeah, especially like we were talking about with how distant it is. It can be giving somebody a ride. It can be those type of things. And I don't know if that was our video that we put out on that, because that's something that we have seen a lot. We've had multiple clients that are these, clean cut, teenage boys for whatever reason, who are getting recruited to just, give somebody a ride across the border, and they don't think they're doing anything wrong. And maybe in their head, they're thinking, if I get caught, this other person's going to be in trouble, but I'm just driving. Right.
Right.
Um,
And they recruit these clean-cut white boys because they look less suspicious. Let's be clear.
Probably. I'm sure that doesn't hurt. Yeah.
Okay, let's talk about 314. It's related, and it does feel like, sex trafficking and illegal immigration certainly has become very tied together. So 314 does a couple things. It makes it a crime in Arizona, not just a federal law crime, but an Arizona crime to enter this state unlawfully at a border. And then it also increases penalties for fentanyl. So let's take both of those separately.
Yeah.
Can you talk first about the state law of criminalizing being illegal? I don't know even how to say it properly.
Right. The way it's actually criminalized is that you crossed illegally. That the act was that you crossed the border of Mexico to Arizona at not a legal port of entry. So there's a few things to talk about with that, right? Number one is just kind of the really interesting piece that's saying, hey, we're now imposing state crimes, creating a state crime for doing that. It's not actually for being here illegally. It's actually for the crossing. There's so much to think about there. Is that it becomes, number one, obviously, it means that local state agency police forces can arrest people for this. Now, a police force in Mesa can't really look and say, hey, I think you crossed this port, illegally. So how's that going to be enforced? That's really interesting. Obviously, we have issues right now where Sheriff Joe Arpaio years ago was found to have basically just racially profiled and just basically said, your last name sounds like a Hispanic last name. You look Hispanic, and so I suspect you. And we're still dealing with that. The Department of Justice, Arizona, is still in the process of trying to come into compliance and show that we are not doing that. Now we have this new statute that, in my eyes, would really invite that to happen. So that's kind of one of the things to think about.
Well, it feels like that would be impossible for prosecutors to prove. So you arrest someone or you pull them over and you find out that they are not here legally, but how is that officer supposed to gather the evidence of when they crossed the border illegally and prove that? Like that, it feels impossible.
Feels impossible. Yeah. To me, that does not seem like a realistic, and I don't know if they crafted it that way on purpose because it was meant to just be a deterrent. I don't really know, because the other piece, another piece, not the other piece, but another piece that I've thought through is what it does is gives local police the ability to investigate and arrest. It gives then a state acting judge the right to deport, to order deportation.
Right.
I don't think they have the right to command the federal government to do that. And so what does that mean? Does it mean they're being deported from the state by state actors? How that's going to get done and what's the due process for that, I really have no idea. And so I'm interested to see. Now, there's so much to talk about with this, because you also see that, I think this was put in place by people who, there's a lot of contradictions in politics here, but, who were concerned that if one administration took control or kept control, that there would be no deportation, there would be no kind of act that was happening. And so they wanted this state law to be able to do it. And now that the Trump administration is going to be coming back, all indications are that at least most people are saying there's really no need for the state to do this, because they fully expect, the federal government to do that, which is, it's really their role. Now there's so many things to talk about. The other big piece of the enforcement or this law actually taking effect, it's not like most laws where, okay, it takes effect as of January 1 or whenever that takes place. This has a provision in it that says this piece of the statute, and you talked about the fentanyl piece, so it doesn't apply to that piece. This piece of the statute of local enforcement for immigration does not go into effect unless another state's goes into effect, and then ours would be 60 days later. Now, many of those are happening right now, and they're up on appeal to the United States Supreme Court. And so I guess we will see whether or not that's going to take place, but it doesn't just automatically go into place as of such and such date.
Okay. Well, I know the Senate President, Warren Peterson, who's here in Gilbert, so Arizona State President, I think that's how you say it, Senate President, said that it's probably not an issue now because the Trump administration is going to handle deportation and immigration so proactively that Arizona won't have to worry about it. So that is going to be very different, right, in its implementation than 313 that we talked about. 313 is here to stay. Is there any changing it? Like if people wanted to change it, how would 313 get changed?
So it could be changed a couple of different ways. Number one is by the legislature doing it. That could be done, based on, it would have to be a new measure that would be voted on. Okay. So I say they would change it, but I think that it would have to be voted upon because this one was voted on.
Right. Like, is the legislature allowed to undo a ballot measure? I don't think they are.
Not just unilaterally. Yeah.
No.
They'd have to go through a process. And I'm not an administrative law expert or anything like that. But I'm sorry. I got this ding happening with my Slack, and I need to silence it. Dave is
do not disturb, buddy.
He is a prolific slacker.
That's great.
All right. Okay. Notifications paused. Hopefully that works. Yeah, and I think that, again, this would take a lot of lobbying, and I don't want to get too deep in the weeds on this, but this is the same type we see with a lot of criminal kind of proposals where nobody wants to be seen as somebody who fought against harsh enforcement for DUI or domestic violence. But sometimes the statutes just don't make sense, or there's an issue with them. And so we do have, there's lobbying organizations and things that do that to try to explain to the legislators, okay, I get it. Like this sounds really good, the way that it's worded. But let me give you some examples. And so potentially they can propose a change to it. That is an interesting question, whether they can then do a new law. But I think you're right. I think that our thought on that is correct, that if it was done, as part of this process, that it would have to be the people doing it again, which I don't see that happening. I don't see, people, unless there is just such a big movement to explain why this is not fair and not right. I just don't see it changing. And again, my experience in explaining this to people is that it doesn't engender a lot of sympathy.
Right.
Because even though because I'm in this every day and I compare it to other things and I see how the criminal justice system works, for just kind of your everyday, average person, they just hear it and say, yeah, I want to punish sex trafficking really harshly. And I don't disagree with that.
Right.
But natural life in prison is not the answer, in my opinion.
What are the changes to the fentanyl charges that come from ballot measure 314?
So similarly to 313, where it changes the sentencing scheme for a crime that already exists, that's what it does here. Or it really kind of separates it out from other drugs and creates this piece where basically it would immediately take place selling fentanyl that results in a person's death. So it's pretty specific.
Right.
To that, it would be punishable by up to 10 years in prison. But it also creates a crime for non-citizens to submit false documentation when applying for employment. We didn't really talk about that.
Okay, so there's a new crime that also comes from it. Say it again. What is the crime?
Sorry, I'm kind of mingling these together. But so there's a crime now for non-citizens to submit false documentation when applying for employment or attempting to receive benefits from local or state or federal programs, which that one seems unnecessary to me because it's already a crime to...
I would have thought that was illegal.
Yeah, we see that charged. So I don't know if there's a separate type, and it didn't seem to me that it was an exceptionally harsh sentence or anything like that. It's basically, I think, just spelling it out to say if you're not a citizen and you apply for these benefits or obviously using false documentation is a crime already to
Right.
go for a job, but it's generally only used in this situation anyway, where somebody doesn't have documentation to be in the country. But I think it just spells that out, I guess, and they're not specific. Some of them are misdemeanors, some of them are low-level felonies. And we see that all the time. If somebody, they get unemployment benefits and then they start working and they don't tell and they lie and they say that they aren't working and they get those benefits, that is a crime. It will be charged by the AG. But I guess it's just spelling that out for non-citizens. But as far as the fentanyl part of it, it's selling fentanyl. And then for somebody to die from ingesting fentanyl, it gets up to 10 years. Again, it's interesting. I've had a case similar to that, where somebody sold a different drug or provided a different drug to a person who died, and that person was charged with very serious offenses, and they certainly faced 10 years in prison. And I think that, again, it's just kind of, I guess, avoiding getting a better outcome than that, and kind of making minimum penalties or harsher maximum penalties, and it removes other requirements. So for instance, in that case, he provided it to somebody who's like a family member, like a younger family member. So I guess maybe it removes that. So they can be total strangers. There's no need that they have some kind of care over the person. They can sell that fentanyl to them. If it kills them, then they are subject to up to 10 years in prison, which I think makes sense.
It does make sense. It seems like there's probably already the ability to get, okay. So you're saying if you give drugs to someone and they die, you can be charged with a crime, and you could have been charged with a crime before the ballot measure.
You could, but I'm realizing there were additional elements that kind of had to be shown in that kind of a case, where this one's going to be cleaner for the state to say, if you sell fentanyl and that person dies, we don't have to prove, all these other things to make it so you had some type of duty to care for this person. It's just making it, I think, an easier conviction for the state on something like that. And that is meant to be a deterrent. And I think this would be more of an effective deterrent.
Can fentanyl be prescribed? Like, what if a doctor prescribes fentanyl and someone dies?
That's a good question. I don't see it prescribed as like a regular thing that you take, but it is something that is administered in a hospital for somebody that has suffered an injury or a major medical event. So it is something that is used in the medical setting. I can't speak for sure on whether it's ever prescribed. I've never seen that. Okay,
got it. What are the blues drugs that people talk about? They're the pills. Is that oxycodone?
I don't know.
Okay.
Yeah. So, but what I think if we are looking at this statute and thinking through it, what could be the complication, right? Is that one of the big issues with fentanyl is that it's being laced into all kinds of other drugs. And so somebody might think that they are, it's not like this is good or anything, but they're a high school dealer, right? They're a guy who goes to high school and he gets these drugs and he sells them, for money or whatever. He thinks he's selling oxy, or he thinks he's, selling different drugs, and it turns out they're laced or have fentanyl. I would anticipate that person is going to be subject to this statute.
Sure. But the sentence is just up to 10 years. That still leaves all the discretion in the world, right, for judges and prosecutors.
Yeah, I haven't seen the actual, it's going to depend on how the text of that actually comes out. So I'm not going to speak like definitively on, yes, it's not going to create a minimum. But the way that it's worded right now, as far as what I saw in the proposition, it doesn't create a minimum.
Okay. Ryan, thank you so much. I don't think I have any other questions, but I really appreciate that. People need to know, they especially need to understand the implications and what constitutes child sex trafficking.
Yeah, that's a big one.
They have to understand this because it's just so prevalent. Like this week, Matt Gaetz' file was leaked, and there were a web of Venmo payments to underage girls. That counts, right?
Absolutely.
Matt Gaetz, under this law, would go to prison without question for the rest of his life.
Yep.
And this person,
if convicted, the judge would have no option but to give natural life under those facts that are alleged right now. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, well, hopefully we can get that out there and people will hear about it. And my best hope is that the industry shrinks. I don't know if it's possible,
Right.
but it would
We
be
would all love
really
that.
great to see the child sex trafficking and prostitution industry shrink.
Right. We would love that. And I think everybody would love that. And maybe that's a consequence that I'm, a pessimist and I don't see that as the result of this law, but uh, that would be fantastic. We'd all be for it.
Thank you so much, Ryan. I appreciate it. And we will put all of the information for where people know to contact you if they find themselves in trouble for any of the things we've talked about or any of the things that you might get in trouble for.
I appreciate that.
Thanks,
Thank you, Billy.
Ryan.
Good to see you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks so much for listening to the Modern Arizona podcast. If you've enjoyed what you've heard today, make sure to download it, like it, leave a review, and share it with your friends. If you know someone who would be a good guest or you would like to be on the Modern Arizona podcast, make sure to give us an email or reach out to us at mymodernlaw.com.